Hello, my name's David Bruce. In the 1950s and 60s, a street musician known as Moondog was a regular feature of 6th Avenue in New York. He was a strange figure wearing a Viking costume, and he became something of a landmark in the city, playing his unusual compositions on his own homemade instruments. The music he played was often in odd time signatures, 7/8s and 5/4s. He called his rhythms snake time and described them as a slithery rhythm in times that are not ordinary. I'm not gonna die in 4/4 time. He became quite well known amongst the more experimental composers of the city, and he was influential on two in particular who later became known as pioneers of minimalism in music, Steve Reich and Philip Glass.
There was a piece in the Village Voice about him in '69. The article said that he was looking for a place to live. So I walked up to the work and I told him I had a place and I invited him to come and stay there. He stayed for a year.
And Glass later said that they took his music very seriously and understood and appreciated it much more than what we were exposed to at Juilliard. But I think Moondog would have been quite surprised to see how far his ideas ended up spreading. The approaches to rhythm, sound and instrumentation pioneered by both Moondog and the early minimalists had influences on the way a huge number of composers would write, myself included, an influence both in their choice of instruments but also in the ways they wrote for conventional instruments. So these choices and techniques are now part of the repertoire of tricks that many composers use when writing for orchestra. Reich and Glass realised that for the new kind of music they were looking to create, they would need very specific kinds of instruments. The first pieces they wrote tended to use pianos and keyboards. And then later they add pitched percussion instruments like the vibraphone and the marimba. What made these instruments particularly useful to the minimalists was this ability to play pitched notes that have a sharp attack and decay. So you get a clear pitched sound, but it can be very short and very precise. And crucially as well, there were already plenty of players, keyboard players and percussionists who could play them. Percussionists, of course, in Western music have tended to find themselves in pretty superficial roles, the crash of the cymbals at the climax of an orchestral build-up and so on. But the minimalists were among the first to really bring them into the foreground as soloists, and they also created entirely new ensembles that mixed multiple pitched percussionists with multiple keyboards, and this led to both Reich and Glass forming their own ensembles, putting together groups of these players to play their pieces. This in itself is probably one of the major lasting influences of minimalism, the growth of solo percussion and percussion groups. And today there are many groups and many composers writing solo pieces for say percussion quartet or even percussion concertos. For the minimalists this ended up being a double success. The percussion instruments were tailor-made to the new kind of music they were writing, but in combination they also represented something completely new, a sound world that hadn't been heard before, at least in Western music, and a complete break with the expressive norms of the Romantic era symphonic music. And to me the minimalist sound is still one of the most distinctive sounds of 20th century music. I mean, if you think about the typical instruments in an orchestra, the strings, the woodwind instruments like the clarinet or the bassoon, the brass instruments like the trumpet or the French horn, what's really striking is that they're all instruments designed for smooth legato playing. They all have this sort of vocal quality. That's not to say that they can't play other types of sound, but what you might call their default setting, their normal way of playing, would be sustained lyrical lines. And this, I think, stems particularly from the Romantic era and the kind of melodic lines composers most wanted to write in the 19th century. It's interesting to think back before the era of symphonic music, and these same kinds of short, more distinctive sounds that the minimalists found useful were once again more common, only now in the form of plucked instruments like the mandolin, the harpsichord, the lute and so on. I've always been a fan of plucked instruments myself. I even wrote a piece recently for all 5 of the main plucked instruments. And I think for me, part of this interest in plucked instruments stems from the same logic that drove the minimalist choices, the ability to create more precise rhythms, and move away from the overused romantic ways of writing, but also the practical fact that there do exist players who can actually play these instruments, even if they aren't necessarily the most common people to find in a new music group. So all of this intro is really just an excuse to look at the orchestration in one of my favourite pieces to emerge 20 years or so after those early minimalist pieces. It's John Adams's Chairman Dances. Now, John Adams is sometimes thought of as a minimalist himself, and his earliest work certainly fell very much under the influence of Reich and Glass. This piece sits on the borderline between those early minimalist pieces and the later more chromatic style, and for me it's one of his most successful and enjoyable works. Although it's written for a fairly standard symphonic orchestra, you'll see that there's a lot of influence from minimalist technique, subverting of that lyrical, romantic orchestral style. So there's a lot of staccato and even staccatissimo, there's a lot of pizzicato, and of course a lot of use of piano and tuned percussion. We'll look more in a minute in detail at how he uses the strings, but first let's look at what might be, I think, another direct influence from the sound world of the pitched percussion ensemble. So pianos, as well as metal pitched percussion instruments like the vibraphone, give you the option of not just short notes, but using a pedal to create a more sustained sound. It's a sound that has the same sharp attack, but now with the sustained note after it. Digital producers talk about attack, decay, sustain and release, so the attack and the decay are the initial impact of the note. A soft attack means the note eases in gradually, whereas a hard attack means it starts at full volume right away. And the sustain portion is what's left after the initial attack. But in something like a vibraphone with the pedal held down, it might look something like this. An initial attack followed by a quick decay down to a long sustained sound. So how would you achieve this using other orchestral instruments? Well, you might try something like using a forte piano marking or a sforzando piano. So that instructs the player to play loud and then immediately soft on the same note, a sharper attack and a quieter sustain. But even here, on a violin or a clarinet, say, the attack wouldn't be as sharp as a percussion sound. So one trick Adams does in this piece is to modify the attack, and he does this by adding other instruments. So here you can see the sustain note is on the oboes and a cello harmonic, but the attack of the note is started off by a harp. So you get this kick at the start of the note, but then only the quieter sustain portion of the sound remains. And here he goes further, overlaying multiple attacks from the piano, harp, glock and vibes, all picking out notes which then ring on in the strings and oboe. And I think if this is not a direct imitation of the vibraphone, it certainly comes out of the need for the same sort of sound. I should say that this idea of modifying the attack isn't particularly new. The opening of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, which I talked about in my Beethoven video, is a massive modification of the attack of the oboe. I think this actually needs a whole video to itself because it's fascinating how important the attack of the sound is to our ability to understand which instrument's playing it. If you only hear the sustain portion of the sound, it's not always easy to tell. And balancing different orchestrations of these percussive stabs is one of the things Adams is particularly good at. Here you can see a powerful blast from 5 instruments all doubled together. The stopped horn, oboe, harp, piano and violin pits. And in cross rhythm to all of these we have the open horn and 2 trumpets. Now the power of these 3 brass instruments easily matches the other 5 put together, but it makes a different enough tone to sound separate and distinct from it. And then later a 3rd punctuating layer enters with high piccolo, high piano and glock. So this kind of multi-layered but crystal clear texture is one of the fresh sounds Adams brings to the orchestra. So when it comes to strings, we've seen how we can create short percussive sounds using short staccatos and pizzicatos. You might think that to create a short stab from 2 notes would be less clear, less precise. But here you can see Adams doing exactly that. This is produced by a very fast back and 2 of the bow on the strings. And the result is a kind of stronger accent, I think. It's a great effect. When it comes to fast repeated bowed notes on string instruments, it's important to remember that there are 2 ways you can play them. There's what's called on the string or off the string. So these again are bowing techniques. So with on the string, the bow stays the whole time on the string and the repetition sounds a bit smoother. If it's off the string, the bow bounces up and down off the string in between each note, and the sound feels more active. Unfortunately, I can't really play it. You can hear examples of both of these techniques in chairman dances. Here you can hear the off-the-string technique in the second violins actually playing harmonics, adding that liveliness to the texture. And then a few moments later, for a useful comparison, here's a similar sound but now marked on the string. And in fact, the increased use of harmonics by Adams and many other contemporary composers could arguably be another influence of the vibraphone. They both have this pure, glassy, vibrato-free, unromantic tone. Finally, staying with the opening bars of the chairman dances, there's another classic Adams technique, this rocking back and two between two repeated notes. Again, this is an idea that would make perfect sense on a pitched percussion instrument or on the piano. Long staccato lines like this can cause problems when it comes to other instruments. The clarinet in particular has a limit on the amount of repeated staccato notes it can play. If you go on too long with staccatos, the tongue just dries up and the notes stop sounding. And one way to overcome this is to use a bit of cunning interplay between two instruments. The pattern does appear later on the clarinets, but here we can see it most clearly right at the start on the piccolos. So here's piccolo 1, and here's piccolo 2. But together, this is how they sound. So the upper notes are what come through strongest, and it still sounds pretty staccato overall. But now this pattern can continue indefinitely, even with the clarinets. And I think it just becomes a little bit more natural, a little less robotic for the players to play. So it results in a more effective sound than just repeating the same notes. I suppose you could call this a kind of composite melody or hocketing. Hocketing is a technique where you use more than one instrument to create a melody line, splitting a single line up into multiple instruments. I always find it a fascinating technique. It's like an illusion because what the individual players play sounds so different to the combined result. The thing you hear is not actually played by anyone. This was a common technique in medieval music, but there are even examples in the Romantic repertoire, like here in Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. Here's what we all hear. And here's what violin 1 is playing. And here's what violin 2 is playing. In Tchaikovsky's case, I heard the suggestion that he wanted the violins to be placed unusually on opposite sides of the stage, which would have turned this, I think, into an interesting stereo effect. So I hope you enjoyed this little look at how John Adams writes for orchestra, and I hope you can see that the technique and instrumentation of early minimalism had a profound effect on him, one which has resonated through composition and orchestral writing to this day. For me, as I say, it's probably one of the most distinctive sounds of the last century, but do you think there's any other sounds that have had a larger influence on composers? Do let me know in the comments. Thanks as ever to my patrons on Patreon for supporting the channel. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And thanks very much to you for watching, and I'll see you next time.